Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. We talk a lot on the show about taking action and making change, but today we're looking at something that might seem, well, a little more passive.
You mean like taking a break?
Kind of,
Yeah.
but it's actually way more powerful and complex than it seems. We're diving into the concept of silence, specifically how it plays out in the world of social justice.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah.
Silence. Okay, yeah, I see where this is going.
Right. It might seem counterintuitive, but trust me, this is a deep one. Our main source material today is an article called, get this, The Danger of Silence, Why Speaking Up Matters in Social Justice. And it really makes you think about all the ways silence can be a force, even a tool.
A tool of oppression, even.
Yeah.
Yeah, the article gets right into that. It doesn't waste any time making the point that silence is a lot more than just, like, not talking.
Oh, yeah, it goes way beyond just keeping your mouth shut.
Right. It's about inaction, too.
Yeah.
And about systems that just don't respond.
Yeah.
And even sometimes about deliberately shutting certain voices down.
That's heavy stuff. It makes me think of that whole bystander effect thing. Have you ever been in a situation where, like, you knew you should say something, but you just froze?
Oh, totally. That's exactly the kind of personal silence the article talks about. Like, they give an example of someone seeing discrimination happening, but not doing anything about it, just standing there. That's silence in action, right? Or inaction, I guess.
It's like choosing to be a part of the problem by not being part of the solution. And then you take it up a level, like, what about companies that just ignore their employees when they complain about unfair treatment? That's silence too, but it's, like, baked into the system.
Systemic silence. Yeah, and it can do a ton of damage.
It's wild how this idea of silence has popped up again and again throughout history, especially when you look at social justice movements. The article digs into a few big ones like the civil rights movement, LGBTQ plus rights, even Black Lives Matter. What I found really interesting was that those movements span like decades, totally different eras, but silence played a huge role in every single one.
That's a great point. Yeah, the article does a good job of showing that even though the contexts were totally different, silence was always there. Sometimes it was like a wall holding people back, and other times it was like the fuel that kicked things off.
Oh, I like that. So, like, during the civil rights movement, there was so much fear, right? People were terrified to speak out against racism, so the system just kept chugging along, oppressing people. But then you have these incredible figures like, of course, Martin Luther King Jr., who were like, nope, I'm done being silent.
And when people like that break the silence, it's powerful. They
Yeah.
inspire others to do the same, and then suddenly you have a whole movement.
Totally. And speaking of powerful moments, the article also talks about the LGBTQ plus rights movement. For years, it was like this big unspoken thing, right? Like nobody talked about sexual orientation or gender identity. It was just taboo.
Right, totally taboo. But then you have an event like the Stonewall riots, which was just this explosion of, like, we're not going to be silent anymore. Yeah.
Exactly. It was a total turning point. And then you fast forward to like today with the Black Lives Matter movement. It's super interesting because it came up in a time when like social media is everything.
Yeah, it's like a whole different ballgame. Suddenly, everyone has a platform to share their experiences and challenge the silence around racial injustice in a way that just wasn't possible before. But it makes you wonder, right? Has social media made it easier to break the silence, or does it come with its own set of problems?
Ooh, that's a great question. It definitely gives me something to think about. But I'm also really curious about the impact of silence, not just on society as a whole, but also on like individuals. Can staying silent actually, mess with your head?
Oh, absolutely.
Like,
And the article digs into some of the psychology behind that. It basically describes silence as, hold on, how did they put it? It's a double-edged sword, that's it.
okay, so sometimes it can protect you, but other times it can hurt you.
Yeah, exactly. Like, on one hand, if you stay silent, you might be protecting yourself from, like, harm or backlash or whatever. But then on the other hand, it can leave you feeling alone, powerless, even guilty.
Oh, I see. Like, if you're a kid who sees someone getting bullied, but you don't say anything because you're scared of becoming the next target, you're safe for now, but you also feel terrible for not sticking up for the person.
Exactly. And that's a tough spot to be in, that inner conflict between wanting to do the right thing, but also being afraid.
Oof, it's real. I mean, haven't we all been there at some point? I know I have, and I remember.
It's tough, for sure. That feeling of, like, wanting to say something, but also knowing that there might be consequences. And the article points out that it's not just about individual fear either.
What do you mean?
Well, when people are scared to speak up, it actually gives more power to the oppressors.
Oh, right, because it keeps them in control.
Exactly. It's like a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
And it's not just individuals that suffer from all this silence either. Whole communities can be impacted.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, if people are constantly avoiding tough conversations about injustice, then those problems just become, like, invisible.
And normalized. It's like everyone's looking the other way, so the problems just get worse.
Hmm.
And that leads to another messed thing about silence. Um, it could be used as a weapon, basically.
Web. Okay, now I'm really interested.
Yeah, the article talks about how people in power, whether it's in the government or companies or even just like families, they use silence to shut down anyone who disagrees with them.
Oh, so it's not just about people being too scared to talk. It's about people in charge deliberately creating a culture of silence so they can stay in control.
Exactly. And that's where the idea of complicity comes in, which I thought was really interesting.
Implicit. Okay, remind me what that means again.
Well, in this context, it basically means that if you stay silent about injustice, you're not really being neutral. You're kind of saying that it's okay, even if you don't realize it.
Oh, I see what you mean. Like, if you see something bad happening but you don't do anything to stop it, you're kind of a part of the problem, even if you don't want to be.
Right. So, like, let's say you're at work and someone's telling sexist jokes and everyone's just laughing along. Even if you don't think the jokes are funny, you might not say anything because you don't want to cause a scene.
And in that situation, staying silent actually makes the problem worse because it shows that those kinds of jokes are acceptable.
Yeah, it creates a hostile environment, even if nobody's directly calling anyone out or anything. But, enough about the bad stuff. The article does give some ideas for how to break the silence, which is hopeful.
Oh, good. I was wondering about that. So, like, where do we even start?
Well, education is a big one. The more we understand these issues, the better equipped we are to speak out against them.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's about doing our own research, listening to people's stories, and really taking the time to understand the problems.
Exactly. And I'm a big believer in the power of storytelling. Personal stories can be so powerful in breaking the silence.
Totally. Stories help us connect with each other and build empathy, which can lead to real change. Actually, the article talks about the hashtag #MeToo movement as a great example of this.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. It started with just a hashtag, right? But it quickly turned into this global movement where survivors of sexual assault felt empowered to share their stories and break the silence.
It's incredible how something so simple can spark so much change. But, not everyone feels comfortable sharing their personal experiences publicly, and that's totally okay. Are there other ways to get involved and speak up?
For sure. The article talks about grassroots movements like Black Lives Matter, where people come together and demand change through collective action.
So it's about finding ways to make our voices heard, whether it's individually or as part of a group.
Exactly. And the article also mentions socially oriented campaigns, like online petitions or educational workshops, things like that.
So many options. But what about people who aren't directly affected by these injustices? How can they be helpful allies?
Well, the article makes it very clear. Being an ally is about action, not just good intentions.
Right. So it's not enough to just say you support a cause. You have to actually do something.
Exactly. It's about actively speaking out against injustice,
Yeah.
even when it's uncomfortable, and using whatever privilege you have to amplify marginalized voices.
So if you see something wrong happening, don't just stand there. Do something about it.
Exactly. Even something small can make a difference.
Yeah.
But it's also important to talk about what happens when we don't speak up. What are the consequences of staying silent?
Yeah, that's a good point. It can't all be sunshine and roses. There have to be downsides too.
Right. And the article gets pretty real about that. Like, on a societal level, if we keep ignoring these problems, they're just going to get worse.
It's like that saying, ignoring a problem doesn't make it go away.
Exactly. And it can even get to the point where injustice becomes so normal that we don't even see it anymore. Kind of like a frog in boiling water.
Ooh, yeah, that's a good analogy. The frog doesn't realize it's being cooked until it's too late. But what about the impact on individuals? Staying silent when you know you should speak up has got to be rough on your conscience.
Oh, for sure. The article mentions guilt, shame, regret, all that fun stuff.
It's like you could have done something, but you didn't, and now you're stuck with that feeling.
Yeah, and that can really eat away at you. But hey, let's end this section on a more positive note. The article does talk about some inspiring success stories, right?
Oh, good. I was hoping it wasn't all doom and gloom.
Not at all. It's important to remember that as powerful as silence can be, speaking up can be even more powerful. Like, the article talks about the civil rights movement and how people like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. refused to stay silent.
Right, and their courage inspired millions of others to join the fight for equality.
Exactly. And their actions led to huge changes, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Wow, talk about making a difference. And we already talked about the hashtag #MeToo movement, which is another amazing example of the power of breaking the silence. But you know what? We've covered so much ground already, and there's still more to explore. In part 3, we're going to shift gears a bit and talk about how silence shows up in our everyday lives. Okay, so we're back. And, up until now, we've been talking about silence in, like, these big historical movements.
Big picture stuff, yeah.
But now I want to bring it down to earth a bit. Like, how does all this silence stuff play out in our everyday lives?
You're right. The article focuses on these huge movements, but silence is everywhere, really. It's in our families, at work, with our friends.
It's even inside our own heads sometimes.
Totally. And those little silences, they matter too, even if they don't seem as dramatic as, like, a protest or something.
It's so easy to just brush those little moments off, Like maybe you see someone make a microaggression at work, but you don't want to cause a scene. Or a family member says something prejudiced, but you just let it slide to avoid a fight.
It happens all the time. We convince ourselves that it's not a big deal or that it's not our place to say anything. But the article makes this point that I thought was really powerful. If we can't even speak up against injustice in our own lives, how are we supposed to challenge it out in the world?
It's like practice, right?
Exactly. The more we practice speaking up against bias and unfairness in our own little worlds, the stronger we get and the more confident we feel about doing it on a bigger scale.
I love that. So speaking up is like a muscle. We got to work it out to make it stronger.
Totally. But I get it. It could be scary, especially when it involves people we care about.
It's way easier to just stay quiet and avoid conflict.
Yeah.
But if we want to make a real difference, we got to get comfortable with being a little uncomfortable.
Right. But remember, speaking up doesn't have to be this big, dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it's just about asking a question or saying that something made you feel uncomfortable.
Right. You don't have to go in guns blazing. Just be honest and open.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, let's say you're hanging out with friends and someone cracks a joke that you find offensive. Instead of just sitting there awkwardly, you could try saying something like, "Hey, that joke kind of rubbed me the wrong way. I know you probably didn't mean anything by it, but..."
Right. You're not trying to make anyone feel bad. You're just trying to have an honest conversation.
And honestly, most people aren't trying to be jerks. They just might not realize the impact of their words.
So it's like we're giving them a chance to learn and grow.
Exactly. We can turn these awkward moments into opportunities to educate each other and make things better.
Yeah.
And, the article also acknowledges that we're not going to get it right every time.
Oh, for sure. We're all human. We're going to mess up sometimes.
It's all part of the process. The important thing is that we keep trying, we keep learning, and we never give up on the power of our voices.
I love that. And it's such a good reminder that breaking the silence isn't just about shouting from the rooftops. It's about those everyday interactions, those little moments where we have a choice to speak up or stay quiet.
Yeah, it's a constant process of, like, checking ourselves, finding our voices, and using them to make the world a little bit better, one conversation at a time.
So well said. As we wrap up this deep dive into the danger of silence, what's the one takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
It's simple, really. Silence is a choice. And when it comes to fighting injustice, even the smallest voice can make a difference.
So powerful. We've covered so much today, from the history of silence to practical tips for speaking up in our daily lives. I hope everyone listening feels inspired to recognize their own power to make a difference.
Absolutely. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep speaking up, even when it's hard.
You got it. And with that, we're wrapping up another deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.